Press Club and the Ray C. Bliss Institute of Applied Politics at the University of Akron. I want to welcome you all to come here today to hear from Pulitzer Prize-winning author, journalist, and producer Hedrick Smith. More on him later. I am Dave Cohen, Vice President for Programs of the Akron Press Club, and also Professor of Political Science and Fellow at the Ray C. Bliss Institute of Applied Politics at the University of Akron. I have a couple of housekeeping items to address before we get started. We do have two upcoming events on our schedule. April 28th, we have a panel on the Akron Marathon. We'll have three panelists on that, all members of the organization. And that is being co-sponsored by the Cuyahoga Valley National Park. May 19th, we have a neat event planned with the owner of the Akron Rubber Ducks, Ken Babby, which is being co-sponsored by the Knight Foundation. He's going to be talking about use of social media, and that will be at the Duck Club in Canal Park. It'll be an evening event, and details of that event are available on our website. Speaking of our website, it is akronpressclub.org. It has all sorts of details of events and membership information. If you are not a member, you should consider joining. It's the best bargain in town, $50 for an annual membership for individuals and $15 for students. And I see a few of my students in the audience. You should think about joining. Nice thing to put on your resume. Also, please like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter at Akron Press Club, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Our programs are generously recorded by the Akron Community Foundation and later uploaded to YouTube, and I would like to thank the Akron Community Foundation for providing this free community service for us. As is the tradition of the Press Club, we will have time for Q&A after the prepared remarks. There are index cards on the table with pens. Please write your questions down, and someone will collect them during the program. I'd like to thank you all for coming out today. Your support of these luncheons allows the Press Club to fund scholarships for student journalists and public relations professionals. Now, if you would please silence your cell phones and any other noise-making devices, we will get started. And I'm here to introduce Hedrick Smith, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning former New York Times reporter and editor and Emmy Award-winning producer and correspondent. He's established himself over the past 50 years of his career as one of America's most distinguished journalists. He was born in Scotland. After graduating from Williams College, where he earned a BA in American History and Literature, he did graduate work as a Fulbright Scholar at Oxford University. He was a reporter for the New York Times from 1962 to 1988. During his career with the Times, he covered stories such as the Civil Rights Struggle, the Vietnam War, and the Cold War from both Moscow and Washington. Smith has worked for PBS since 1989, where he created 26 primetime specials. His work focused on topics such as terrorism, Wall Street, Soviet perestroika, Walmart, Enron, tax evasion, education reform, healthcare, the environment, and the Washington power game. In 1971, as Times chief diplomatic correspondent, Smith was a member of the team which produced the Pentagon Papers series. And in 1974, he was awarded a Pulitzer Prize for international reporting for his coverage of the Soviet Union and its allies in Eastern Europe. The Russians was a book which was based on his years as New York Times Moscow bureau chief from 1971 to 1974. It was a #1 American bestseller. It has since been translated into 16 languages and has been widely used in university and college courses. That book was followed by yet another book, which was a national bestseller called The Power Game, How Washington Works, which was an influential political masterpiece and considered a Bible for newly elected members of Congress and their staffs. And I just got to say, that's how I met Hedrick Smith. I tweeted about The Power Game and how there needs to be a new edition. Best book I've ever read about politics in Washington and how it actually works. His most recent book, Who Stole the American Dream, came out in September of 2012. It's a New York Times bestseller. And so please welcome Mr. Hedrick Smith to the Akron Press Club.
Thank you, David. That's a really kind introduction and heartfelt, I thought, and I appreciate that very much. You know politics well, so to have that accolade from you is meaningful to me. I had the good fortune today to sit down without knowing I was doing it next to Grumpy Abe, and who informed me that he was Grumpy Abe. And fortunately, he told me that he remembered watching the Week in Review, which you didn't happen to mention. It's one of the things that I did. I don't. Is there anybody else in the program in the audience who remembers watching the Week in Review when Paul Duke was the moderator? Yeah. I'm going to tell you one quick Watch the Week in Review story that I think you'll enjoy because it's about the press and the operation of the press. If you don't know the program, Paul Duke, the moderator, now Gwen Eiffel, sits at the end of the table, and there are 4 reporters who sit around and they lead the conversation one after the other. And often I did the #1 spot, and Jack Nelson of the Los Angeles Times would be #2, and Hank Johnson would be #3, and Charlie McDowell of the Richmond Times-Dispatch would be in the #4 slot. Well, you know, the way the program operates, the lead reporter leads the discussion, the others ask questions. McDowell, being in the #4 slot, would ask more questions than anybody else for most of the program, and that occasional letter from a couple in upstate New York. And the first sentence said, "Dear Mr. McDowell, sometimes it seems as though you don't quite understand what the others are talking about." And the second sentence said, "Neither did we." And the third sentence said, "So it's a comfort to have you there." So that was the kind of program we had. I want to talk a little bit today about the press and about America and see if I can weave the two together. Because I think we have a situation in which most of us would agree that the political system is fragmented and it's not operating very effectively. That it's coming apart at the wheels, that they can't get their act together. In fact, that reminds me of one of my favorite Peanuts cartoons. It's the one where Lucy has a card table set up in the backyard and it says psychiatry 1 cent. Well, you know who walks up? Charlie Brown walks up, he puts his penny down, and Lucy says, "You know, Charlie, before I can give you any advice, I need to have you think of life as a voyage on a great ocean liner. Now, there's some people, and they take their deck chairs up to the bow and they look into the future to see where they're headed. And there are other people, and they take their deck chair back to the stern and they look back to see where they've been, to look at the past. Which group do you belong to?" Charlie thought a moment, he scratched his head, he said, "Lucy, I'm having trouble getting my chair unfolded." and that's Washington. But if Washington is fragmented and has a very short attention span and jumps from one problem to another without resolving any of them, that is also a picture of the press. The 24/7 news cycle has got us so focused on the number of eyeballs that most organizations can get in the next 2 or 3 hours, that our attention span and our ability to put our arms around the news and explain the news to people in ways that are meaningful to their lives has deteriorated badly. Now, part of this is the result of economics. There are far fewer of us. If you look at papers like, even big papers like the New York Times, the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, and so forth, we have fewer reporters and editors. And it's that large staff provided it's efficiently used that gives you the arms and the legs and the time and the depth and the resources to go dig out the stories that the NSA is secretly eavesdropping on Americans at home, or that Walter Reed Hospital doesn't operate properly, or that the CIA is running black prisons overseas and so forth, and other great stories that get told locally. But part of it is our own notion of what our function is, and we see our function very much in terms of trying to grab the latest, most titillating news. In fact, titillation is a good way to look at it. We're more interested in amusing, titillating, grabbing the short-term attention of people, rather than most of the time trying to dig beneath the surface of the news, get the flow of the news, get a sense of the trends, and give people a coherent picture so that they can understand what is actually going on in their lives. My contention is that in the biggest story of we missed the biggest story of the last 30 years for a long time. The biggest story of the last 30 years for most Americans was the deterioration of the living standards of middle-class Americans. They had more and more trouble keeping up economically, and we were seeing an enormous growth a canyon-like growth in the inequality of income in America between the 1% and the middle, let alone the bottom. And basically, we didn't really cover that story very much until, believe it or not, Occupy. We all ridicule Occupy and what it didn't achieve, but one thing it did do was it awakened the press to inequality of income. If you go back and look at coverage of the question of inequality of income and middle-class living standards, our coverage was paltry prior to Occupy, and it's been significant since then, which means we were missing that story for a long time. The question is why, and then how important is the question, and then what does that say about what we should be doing today? I think it's an enormously important issue. And I think the issue goes way beyond what we've been told. The story we get, by and large, we get it from our economic leaders, we get it from our corporate leaders, we get it from our politicians, and in lots of instances, we get it from ourselves and the media. And that is that what we're witnessing is the impact of globalization, the impact of advancing technology, the forces of the market, impersonal forces about which human beings really can't do very much. And economists and columnists are fond of quoting that famous economist Joseph Schumpeter talking about the creative destruction of capitalism. This is how economies advance. They destroy old forms, old systems, old industries that are out of mode, that aren't modern, that can't adapt. The buggy whip, the way of the buggy whip succeeded by the automobile, and the internet age succeeding essentially the telephone, and the news business scrambling to get out of print and getting online. So we do have advancing technology. It is terribly important, but we've taken a bye in terms of our human responsibility and the other decisions we could have made. We can look at other countries and see how different they are from us. And once we do that, we understand that they responded to the challenge in a different way than we did. I like to go back to my Oxford years and remember reading Arnold Toynbee, the great British historian who wrote A Study of History, which was a study of 21 civilizations over 6,000 years. And Toynbee tells that story in terms of challenge and response. Each civilization is challenged in some way, and whether or not it thrives, survives, grows, and has influence and prevails depends on its ability to meet the challenge, how it responds to the challenge. He goes back to ancient Egypt, he goes back to the Inca civilization in South America, and he says their challenge initially was the challenge of a hostile environment. The question was whether or not those civilizations could generate a rich enough and a productive enough agricultural economy to sustain a civilization, a settled population, as opposed to nomads following good weather and good climate and so forth. And were they able to do that? Yes, of course, we know they were, not only because we heard it historically, but we can go to the temples at Machu Picchu in Peru, and we can go up and down the Nile and see the pyramids and see the temples that were left behind. So those were civilizations that not only generated a standard of living that would provide homes to tens of thousands of people, but enough excess value, enough excess wealth, so that you had enough people to go build these enormous temples. But they fell victim to another challenge, and that is the challenge of an outside military invader more powerful and more modern than they are. In the case of the Incans, it was the Spaniards, and in the case of the Egyptians, it was the Ottoman Turks. But that's a challenge that we know, a challenge that we know well in America, which is to confront and meet and contain an opponent, a military opponent. Most recently, of course, we did it in World War II, opposing Hitler and the Japanese, and then in the long Cold War with the Soviet Union over half a century. So that's something we've done. But the more interesting and difficult challenge that Toynbee raises about the two civilizations that we admire the most, ancient Greece and ancient Rome, is what he calls the challenge of schisms in the body social, schisms in the soul of the society, what we would call internal conflicts. Each of those great civilizations fell victim and went into decline because they could not cope with the challenge from within. And I maintain that what we have today in America is a challenge from within. We're a divided country. We're divided by money, we're divided by power, and often we're divided by politics and ideology, but money and power are critical. There's a difference between what Wall Street wants and what Main Street wants when they go to Washington. They have very different political agendas. If you listen to a lot of commentators from Wall Street, they constantly worry, and they've been worried for the last 6 years, this isn't new, about inflation. And if you talk to people on Main Street, they're worried about jobs. Jobs versus inflation is a big difference, a big divergence in political agendas, and there's lots that flows from them. But guess what? Congress listens more to Wall Street. Wall Street has captured Congress, and that's been true for since the early 1980s. And that is what affects our politics today. Now, if we're writing about that in the media, we need to know that, and we need to know the basis of that, and we need to make that part of the fabric of our reporting. It needs to be built into it all the time, so that the public gets an understanding that that's what's going on. This is not something that is a matter of bias. This is a matter of something that can be very factually established if you go back and look at voting records, you go back and look at the flow of money into political campaigns, the flow of money into lobbying, and the voting records of people in Congress. And there are political scientists who have done that in great detail, as well as good reporters and good authors of books. So something big has changed. I remember when I came out of college, and came out of Oxford, and then came out of the Air Force, which everybody was doing at that time. I remember an economy in which the wealth and the profits and the gains of the economy were much more widely shared. At least that's what I remember. But I'm white-haired, and when people get white-haired, there's a tendency to say, when I was a young boy, everything worked just really perfect. Just go back to just do it the way we did it when I was young, and boy, everything worked just fine. Just Lake Wobegon, everybody was above average, right? Everybody was average. So I decided to go back and take a look, and I did. And what's interesting is from 1945 to 1975, 76, the productivity of the American workforce roughly doubled. It went up 97%. And the median hourly pay of the typical worker in America went up 95%. 97, 95, dollar for dollar. The gains in the American economy went right through the people in the middle of the American economy. Very important. Economists cut us up into quintiles, top 20%, second 20%, on down the bottom 20%. Over that long 3-decade period, you can see the chart of the average income in each of those quintiles moving up together. They move up and down. It isn't a smooth line, but they're moving up. And actually, the bottom two move up faster than one at the top. I don't want to suggest for a moment that we were approaching income equality. Charlie Wilson, who ran General Motors, the biggest corporation in America back in those days, made 35, 40 times what the average worker made in a GM plant. But they were within shouting distance of each other. It's what the economists call the Great Convergence. What they mean is the top was not that far from the middle, was not that far from the bottom. We had poverty, we had business cycles, we had all kinds of economic problems there. I don't want to suggest we didn't. But we had a sense of cohesion and solidarity that grew partly out of the experience of World War II, for sure, but it also grew out of a sense that everybody was benefiting, that literally, as John F. Kennedy said, that a rising tide lifts all boats. People had a sense that all boats are getting lifted. Think of the contrast today. If you look at the last 30 years, the productivity of the American workforce rose 80%, and the median hourly pay rose 10%. Huge difference in outcome compared to the previous period, okay? And if you look further, and you look at the growth of the entire economy, and I remember when I saw the slogan of Occupy, 99% and 1%, I thought, well, that's a very clever slogan. That fits on a bumper. That's really nice. And we are talking about inequality of income, but 99% and 1%, that's overdoing it. But it isn't overdoing it. It turns out, factually, it is dead on. From 1979 to 2012, 84% of the nation's entire growth in income went to the top 1%. Let me repeat that, because that's a number you should get deeply embedded in your mind. 84% of the entire growth in the monetary income of the United States of America went to the top 1%. You say, well, shrug for a moment? No. That means the other 99% got 16%. In other words, the top 1% alone got 5 times as much as everybody else. So the 99% and the 1% of Occupy is dead on accurate for what's happened to the American economy in the last 30, 35 years. And by the way, it is going on right now. in the recovery. Corporate profits as a percentage of national income are at record levels over the last 85 years, and wages and salaries are at record low levels over the last 65 years. And the gap has continued to widen during the recovery. So when we think about economic stories and when we cover economic stories and we start to think about the impact of public policy, we have got to have these ideas in the background of our minds and in our pens and at our fingertips as we explain situations to Americans. These are undeniable facts. Now, what was interesting to me as I began to think about writing this book, Who Stole the American Dream? And by the way, that was my title at the beginning. My title with my book contract with Random House was The Dream at Risk, because when I started work in 2009, 2010, there wasn't any question that losing 600,000 jobs a month and watching millions of people being foreclosed out of their home, the dream was at risk. But it was only as I did the reporting that I came to the conclusion that an accurate statement was that the dream was stolen. It didn't just drift away. I began to wonder how it was that we had this wider shared prosperity, and then what had happened that took it away. Well, there were two things that mattered in the sharing of the prosperity: ideas and power. The central idea was an idea of sharing wealth and property and profits called stakeholder capitalism. If you go back and read what Charlie Wilson is the CEO of General Motors, or Reg Jones is the CEO of General Electric, or Frank Abrams is the CEO of Exxon, of Standard Oil of New Jersey, or William Remington is the CEO of Coca-Cola said, they said it was the duty, it was the responsibility, in some cases the sacred duty of the CEO to balance the economic interests of all the groups that had a stake in the success of the corporation. Stakeholders. That meant the owners, of course. It meant the managers. It meant rank and file employees. It meant suppliers. It meant creditors. It meant the communities they operated. You had a terrific stake here in Akron in the survival of Goodrich and the presence of Goodrich and Goodyear and Firestone and all the rest. And you're living with an economy now that doesn't have them. So you had a stake in their survival in many ways, and you maybe should have had a role in some of the decisions they made about what to do about their industries. And you probably gave them tax write-off to try to keep them here. So you actually had an economic investment in them in ways that maybe you didn't calculate and didn't use. But in any case, the idea was that the job of the CEO was to balance these interests, and that this was smart business, and that this was smart economics. It was actually Henry Ford who kind of articulated that idea first. There were a lot of other problems about Henry Ford, but when he created the $5 day, he doubled the pay of auto workers in one fell swoop. And he said it was not only fair, but it was smart business, because if he paid his workers more, they could afford to buy the Model T cars that Ford Motor Company produced. And that's what Charlie Wilson and Reg Jones and Frank Abrams and all those other guys said. If we pay our middle-class workers more, they're going to be able to afford the products we produce. Well, guess what? We're not paying the middle class as well as we used to pay the middle class. And that's one of the main reasons why we've had a weak, slow recovery. And by the way, if you look at the history of recoveries from 1990 forward, every single one has taken longer for us to dig out of the ditch. And if you think we've hit the last one, you'll wake up sometime later and remember that Smith said, what is the date? On April 7th, 2015, we're going to have another one. And it'll take us longer unless we fix the inequality of income in this country, because it is consumer demand that drives growth. American companies are not short of capital. Since 2000, American companies have spent $3 trillion buying back the stock of their own company because they couldn't figure out anything else to invest in. There wasn't enough demand for them to invest in new plants, new equipment, and new hires. And in addition to that, they've been sitting at $2 trillion of cash. So cash is not our problem. Investment capital is not our problem. Consumer demand is our problem. And that means middle class pay and middle class living standards are at the heart of our economic problem. In the old days, stakeholder capitalism took care of that. In the new days, it got taken over by shareholder capitalism. And the job of the CEO, according to Milton Friedman, who wrote that famous book, Capitalism and Freedom, in 1961, was the only job of the CEO, and you've heard this phrase often, is to return maximum return to shareholders. When you hear somebody say, listen to this, when you hear somebody say, I believe in shareholder capitalism, understand you have just heard somebody say, I believe in greater inequality of income. Shareholder capitalism means greater inequality of income. Because if you're focused on maximum return to shareholders, you're going to hold wages level, you're going to ship jobs overseas, you're going to cut jobs, you're going to cut benefits, and you're going to deliver the maximum you can to Wall Street. And you're going to buy back your own stock, and since you, the CEO, get paid in your own stock, you're actually voting yourself a pay increase. At the same time, you're holding down the pay increases of your workers. So that's one thing that happened. The second thing that was important, I said, was power. And this is really important to us today. It's important to everybody sitting in this room, and it is particularly important to the younger people sitting in this room, because this is their future. This is all of our future, but most of us are not going to be around as long as they are. In that era of the great middle class heyday, middle class people exercise political power actively. Actively. The most obvious episode, one that we celebrate every year, is Martin Luther King's birthday, is the Civil Rights Movement. That was a movement about expanding American democracy. But there was also a women's movement that said it's unfair for women to work for 41 cents on the dollar and doing the same work as men. There was a consumer movement that said it's not good for Detroit and other places to be producing products that will damage people, perhaps cause car accidents and kill people, which is, by the way, still going on. I mean, General Motors sold back 26 million cars last year. Ralph Nader could have come back, Ralph Nader's revenge. There was an environmental movement. Believe it or not, on April 22nd, 1970, 20 million Americans got off their duffs, left their couches, left their houses, marched to malls, marched to legislative headquarters, state capitals, marched to Washington, took part in parades, had talkathon. 20 million people. Nearly 10% of the American population physically engaged in protest and said it is outrageous that our air and our water are being fouled. Within 1 year, Congress passed 7 major pieces of legislation on the environment. The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Anti-Toxic Substances Act, on and on and on. All of them signed by a pro-business, all but one. Sorry, the Clean Air Act was vetoed by all of them but one, signed by a pro-business President, Richard Nixon. Okay? So citizen power, middle class power had an impact. And it also had an impact on inequality of income. Because in that period, there was public pressure on the government, on Congress, to impose higher tax rates on the wealthy and to raise the minimum wage on a regular basis to lift the floor. There were a lot of other policies, but those two will suffice to explain. Under Eisenhower, Republican president in the 1950s, the maximum marginal tax rate was 92%. Now, we're told today if we raise the taxes above 35% or 39%, the economy will come to a dead standstill. Well, believe me, it didn't stand still under Eisenhower. Then it gets dropped to 77% under Kennedy. During that 2-decade period of the 50s and 60s, the average national growth rate in America was 3.1%. Fast forward to the 2000s when the top marginal tax rate was 35%. Under Bush, the Republican, and Obama, the Democrat, and the average annual growth rate was 1%. 3% with high tax rates, 1% with low tax rates. There's no connection between the marginal tax rate and the ability of the economy to grow. It's not just Smith that's telling you that. The Congressional Research Service has done a study on it, nonpartisan. It's there. Political rhetoric will tell you otherwise, but political rhetoric, most of it, or a lot of it, is hot air. And it's our job to expose that in the press. With facts, not with opinions. We're not entitled to our own opinions, but we're entitled to our own facts. We're not entitled to our own facts. We're entitled to general facts. No, just the opposite. We're not entitled to. No one's entitled to their own facts. It is our job to call balls and strikes foul and fair on the basis of facts. And facts lots of times are available in our history, and we aren't doing the work. We are not providing the context for people to understand what's going on. Now that means calling some people out, and they're going to say you're biased one way or another. Well, our job is to call them one way. I mean, umps get shouted at too. The only thing is they have the right to throw the players out of the game and we don't. Which would be nice. It'd be great to be able to do that. Anyway, you had this active political middle class in that period. And today, where are we? I mean, we think we've really staged a major revolt if we tweet. Or if we like something on Facebook. I mean, come on. Politicians pay attention to when people hang in there. They pay, you know, if you can sign a petition on the internet and be done with it in 30 seconds, the politicians know that. They know you're not going to be back there on that issue tomorrow. There's going to be a new petition tomorrow. They pay attention to people who hang in there. So one of the things we're going to have to do is, if we're going to see things change in this country, we're going to have to get re-engaged. Are there things we can do to make the economy work better, to make it fair? Sure. I'm no economist, I'm no expert, but it doesn't take a lot of work to figure it out. In the first place, we have a tax system on American corporations which rewards them for moving jobs overseas. They pay a lower tax rate when they move their jobs and their profits overseas. They pay no taxes on the profits overseas until they bring them back to this country. And by the way, they're able to deduct all their expenses for their overseas operations, even though they pay no taxes on their overseas profits. And when they want to bring them back, they all get together and they lobby Congress to get a special lower tax rate. So instead of paying 35%, which is the corporate tax rate, they pay 5.5%. Well, the answer to that, somebody's going to say, well, Smith, you're against corporations. I said, no, I'm not. I'm actually in favor of the corporations who stay at home with their jobs because they're paying that full 35% tax rate. The economic playing field is unfair to the companies that are staying at home. And the big companies, the multinationals, the General Electrics, the General Motors, the Microsofts, the Payne Webbers, the Goldman Sachs, who do a lot of business overseas, they lobby the hell out of Congress to make sure that tax loophole gets protected. So there's one thing we could do. Another thing we could do is we confront the Chinese who've got an artificially low value to their currency, which makes it more expensive for us to export to them and much cheaper for them to export to us. So we need to get together. A whole bunch of other countries feel the same way and do something about that. We talk about getting tough with the Chinese, but we're afraid of getting tough with the Chinese. And one reason is they hold $2 trillion of debt in America. Oh, so then that gets into the balance of trade. Well, we could do something about the balance of trade by bringing jobs back here. How do you do that? Well, you do that by beginning to revive the manufacturing sector, which was so important. And do you know Ohio is one of the states that has been hardest hit by the loss of manufacturing? In the 2000 decade, America lost 54,000 factories, and several thousand of them were in your state, and probably several hundred of them, but at least several score of them were in your city or in your county. How do you bring them back? Well, you give some investment incentives to do that, to get people into new fields. You work on worker training. Actually, under the Clinton administration, there were some Republican governors. I remember Tommy Thompson up in Wisconsin ran a wonderful apprenticeship training program that skilled up American high school kids, mid-kids, kids that were not headed for college, to train them to be world-class people in the printing industry, in the graphics industry, and we certainly need them in healthcare. There are all kinds of things we can do there. In the semiconductor industry down in Austin, Texas, the plants that were producing computer chips couldn't find workers to work in the clean rooms. Clean rooms down there only take 4 or 5 engineers per shift, but they take another 20 people that had a good high school education or high school plus a year or two of community college. They had to create an entire program to generate the workers for that. And then it turned out we had a nationwide shortage. So as soon as they did it in Austin, other places like Silicon Valley and Research Triangle in North Carolina and Route 128 around Boston began to steal them. We're way behind in terms of globally training our next generation. Not just college kids, but more particularly that middle strata of people. So there are things like that we can do. I could go on. In the end of my book, Who Stole the American Dream, I got a 10-point plan. It's terrible for a journalist. I felt so awkward doing this because my job is to call balls and strikes. But my editor said, Rick, you got us all in the ditch. You've got to get us out of the ditch. And I disagreed, and my wife said, Rick, Kate's right, you got to do it. So I got 8 or 10 points in there, but I stole them from other people. I mean, I just went and looked at things that looked intelligent. I didn't care whether they were partisan, bipartisan, or whatever. But the truth of the matter is these things aren't going to happen. Washington's not going to move. Washington's not going to deal with immigration. It's not going to deal with globalization and competition. It's not going to deal with climate change. It's not going to deal with national debt. It's not going to deal with student debt. based on the political system we have today. We got a broken political system. And you don't have to ask the American people, they get it. 95% will say the political system is broken. It's gerrymandered. 90% of the political districts in the House of Representatives, I can tell you the outcome of the election in November 2016 today. Because why? It's an old-fashioned word, gerrymandering, we all eyes glaze over. No, we need to think of those as political monopolies. Those are monopolies set up by each party, and the Democrats do it in some states, the Republicans do it in the other states. No party's innocent, both parties are guilty, okay? This is a nonpartisan comment. They are absolutely undermining the integrity of the elections, and they are baking gridlock into Washington. And we're not gonna fix that until we tackle it. In Florida in 2010, they passed an amendment to the Florida Constitution to require the state legislatures to stop partisan gerrymandering. Now it's going to take that, and it's going to take lawsuits, and it's going to take a lot of other things to do something about it. And the other problem we have is political money, dark money. In 2006, there was $5.2 million in dark money in American elections. Money that can move secretly, and nobody could tell where it started and where it ended up. In 2012, that number was $308 million. In 2016, it's going to be over $500 million or more. The Koch brothers and their network have already committed to spend nearly $900 million. They're going to spend more money than either political party. Political party money is in the open. Whether you like it or not, at least you can see who's doing it. With the other money, with the dark money, you cannot tell who's pulling the strings on the puppets. And that's affecting Washington. And not just Washington. It is affecting state government decisions all across the country. Ladies and gentlemen, we have got to get involved again. We in the media have the obligation to explain to people what the score is, not just the little hand in the cookie jar over here, the hand in the cookie jar over there. We got to keep telling people again and again, what's the systemic problem? Everybody's focused on who is going to change America. Let me tell you something. No matter who gets elected president in 2016, they are going to confront a broken political system. And we're not going to get much done. Not many people are going to tell you that, but we have got to start facing that and telling that to people. We are fascinated in the media with the latest squiggle on what Ted Cruz says or what Rand Paul says. I don't mean to denigrate them as candidates. They deserve coverage. But here we are, how many months before the election? And we're worried about the latest squiggle, and we're not taking a look at all at the political system. How many column inches in the Akron Beacon Journal? I don't mean to pick on you. You're in the city that I'm in. If I were somewhere else, I'd pick the Sarasota Tribune or whatever. How many column inches are going to go devoted to the personalities, and how much is going to go to the effect of gerrymandering? Because I'm sure you've got gerrymandering not only in your congressional districts, but in your legislative districts in Ohio, and that greatly affects the ability of the Ohio legislature and the state government to get things done. We got to get the fundamentals, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, it is up to us. The time is now. It's up to us in the media, and it's up to us as citizens. Thank you.
All right, we have time for some questions. You kind of stole my thunder on a few of them, but let me
Just keep going.
piggyback off of what you talked about, which is why would politicians fear inactive citizenry when they have dark money and the Koch brothers on their side? Tell me, because how do you fix that?
Well, the answer is they don't fear them at the moment because we don't have an active citizenry. You got to take it state by state, district by district. Part of the problem here is there's a tendency of those of us who think about politics and care about it to see the national problem, which I've just sketched out. And believe me, that's only a sketch. There's a lot more to it. And they say, oh my God, it's hopeless. We need to break it down and say, what can we do here in our county? What can we do in our city? In Tallahassee, in the last election, they passed a anti-corruption bill for the city of Tallahassee, which required full disclosure of all campaign spending, not just candidates and parties, but all spending in the campaign. It banned any donations from any lobbyist or group to members of the city government or the city council before which they had business. In other words, if you were in the electrical power business, you couldn't go in and give money to candidates and then go in front of the city council and say, we want to raise our rates. Okay? So they banned that. They did a number of other things. You can go on the web today to a site called represent.us and find a ready-made package that you could bring to a reform movement in Akron and put it on your ballot for your next election. I don't know whether it's in this fall or the fall of 2016. Or you could modify it. There are things out there on the internet. There are people at work on these problems. There's a group called the Campaign Legal Center, which is made up of some of the best campaign lawyers in the country. One of them is headed by a guy named Trevor Potter, who is John McCain's legal advisor when McCain was writing the McCain-Feingold legislation to try to do something to regulate campaign money. The answer is that we as individual citizens can't beat organized money. Only organized citizens can even try to match organized money. But the answer is, without it, it's going to keep getting worse. We can't keep sitting back and wringing our hand and saying, they've got to fix it. As long as the pronoun in our sentence is they, nothing's going to happen. The only time it's going to happen is when we change the pronoun from they to we. It's up to us. That's my message. And I think actually, you got a good editorial page for the Akron Beacon Journal. I'm working on your editor right now, smiling at him, but I want to tell you, our country is at stake. I gave you Toynbee at the beginning. We're on the beginning of a decline in this country, and American people know it. There are opinion polls saying that 60% of the American people believe America is in decline. And we don't have to be in decline. We're a resilient, inventive, creative, dynamic, positive people. But we have to take charge. We can't sit back and say, it's terrible, and expect somebody else to do it. And we in the media, and we in business, and we in education are leaders. We're thought leaders. It's time for us to take charge and deal with the big picture and not just deal with the little stories.
Why does the media act sometimes like the National Enquirer, telling false stories, focusing on gossipy stories rather than the realities that are taking place? How do we resolve this, and are we somehow to blame because that's what we want?
I don't know who the we was at the end of the sentence, but one of the reasons the National Enquirer does what it does is it sells. So I think the answer is yes, we are. Until we reward people in the media consistently who are doing the kind of job I'm talking about, who are trying to dig beneath the daily bits and pieces of news and try to put the trends together and give people a better picture, then the media is going to continue to do the superficial job it had. We had a phony belief in the market that when we had cable, if we had 700 cable channels, somehow we were going to generate better news than if we only had 3 networks. Well, it turns out what we got is 700 channels with news that is 1.5 miles wide and 1 centimeter deep, and they're all doing the same news, one kind or another, and they're doing the kind of news you're talking about. They're trying to improve their ratings by titillating people just 1 jot more. And the result is no greater understanding of what the situation is. It costs money, it costs time, it costs an investment of talent and resources, and it takes a commitment to dig deeper and to see that as our principal function, not just batting it out. Now we got to get the daily story out. There's no question about that. But we have to save a certain percentage of our resources and our time to put the picture together repeatedly. And I am counting on Grumpy Abe right here to do it. I'm kidding him, but I understand that Grumpy Abe is one of the guys who does what I'm talking about.
Oops.
Do any of the presidential candidates or potential presidential candidates take positions like those you endorse, and if so, who?
I haven't seen much. I haven't seen much, but we're early in the campaign, and I don't think at this stage of the game you're likely to see it. I mean, probably the person who has articulated publicly some of the ideas that are closer to what I've said on some issues, but not on other issues, is probably Elizabeth Warren, because she's talking about the problem of fixing the structure of Wall Street banks. Wall Street banks are going to take us over the cliff again. And what she's saying is the structure is wrong. It's not a question of being liberal, it's not a question of being anti-bank. What she's saying is look at the laws And look at what's happened. We now have fewer bigger banks than we had before. We've got wealth more concentrated, and it was that concentrated interlocking relationship of the banks that led us over the cliff. So if you're looking at it as a biologist or a chemist or a physicist trying to analyze a problem, you've got all the symptoms there that tell you the problem is actually worse than it was before. And that's not a partisan comment. Now, what she says she wants to do with it may be a partisan political campaign, but at least the analysis of the issue, it seems to me, is right on, and that part of it is nonpartisan. In terms of the encroachment of the government on our civil liberties, I think Rand Paul is probably doing a better job articulating the dangers of the government eavesdropping on all of us today, and that's a terribly important issue for all of us. I mean, Rand Paul says at rallies, do any of you have cell phones? How many of you think it's right for the government to track your movements? The government can track your movements. The government can track your contacts. The government can actually put together, the FBI and the NSA and the CIA can actually put together a portrait of you simply by following you on your cell phone. There is no candidate that I know of either party that is anywhere near as strong as Rand Paul is on opposing that and articulating that danger to our civil liberties over time. Rand Paul and, believe it or not, Pat Leahy, Democrat from Vermont, they're at opposite ends, theoretically, of the political spectrum, but they're actually talking about the same issue. So I mean, I think I don't see anybody talking about gerrymandering. Don't expect incumbent politicians to talk about gerrymandering. That's how they got elected. You're asking a monopolist to have you pass a law to break up monopolies. They're not going to do it. That's going to have to come from outside. So I think some of these issues we can expect some politicians to address. Other of these issues we shouldn't expect any existing office holder or would-be office holder to address because it's against their own personal self-interest.
Do you see the Republican Party ending their split and becoming one party again? And conversely, do you see the Democrats perhaps heading for a split between the Elizabeth Warren wing and the Hillary Clinton wing?
I think both parties are going to continue to be split. I think that's the party. After all, you have to remember the whole idea of a political party in America is the larger tent. It's a coalition. If you look in Britain or you look in Germany, you see parliamentary parties, and there's an effort to try to establish a fairly unified party, and then go take that platform and run and win control of the whole government. Particularly when you have divided government, it's pretty hard to do that in either party. I don't see either party healing its differences, and I actually think those differences are healthy. It's part of what we need in the democracy is the debate going on not only between the parties, but within the parties. I don't think we should lament that at all. Because in the end, to get elected, they got to compromise. And guess what, folks? In the end, if American government is going to work, we got to compromise. That is an idea that has gone out of fashion here. We now have parties in Washington that have almost tribal loyalty. I mean, we get people quitting parties and leaving office. Evan Bayh, Democrat from Indiana in the Senate, and Olympia Snowe, Republican in the Senate, leaving partly because they couldn't stand the consensus required by their party in their body. They couldn't be who they were because the parties were trying to become too unified. We had a much more effective political system when the parties were more fragmented. I mean, political scientists have actually charted votes in Congress of members of Congress over the last 40 or 50, 60 years. And if you go back to the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you can see charts. These would be the Republicans, these would be the Democrats, where the vote patterns overlapped each other. And the most moderate and liberal Republicans, usually from the Northeast, but sometimes from states like Kentucky, like John Sherman Cooper, would overlap the most conservative Democrats, and vice versa. And then over the years, what you've seen is a growing divide, and now the parties barely touch each other. That's an unworkable political system. So actually having the parties having fractious minorities within them is healthy. It's the way we can get around this partisan loyalty that we have now that's become a creed in American politics in Washington, and it is absolutely destructive. The polarized politics of Washington today are one of the major reasons we have gridlock.
The Ohio governor, John Kasich, a Republican and a Wall Street guy, is trying to show his concern for the inequality gap, often against his own Republican Party. Is this a hopeful sign or just politics?
You all know Governor Kasich better than I do. I don't follow him as closely as you do, but I am aware of what you just said. It seems to me that the way Kasich has framed this on at least several public occasions, suggesting that some of his concern about inequality comes from his own religious belief, that it's genuine. Is there political advantage in it? Yeah, but that's interesting because there are lots of other Republicans think that there's political disadvantage in it. That the best thing to do is to be really tough and keep labor down and keep wages down and as I said before, advocate cutting taxes on the wealthy and keeping costs down and shipping jobs overseas. That's the way to grow America. No, my impression is that Governor Kasich is more genuine. I'd like to see more of him. I think it would be a good thing if he were to join the presidential race. My hunch is at this stage of the game, it's too late and he's not likely to do it. But I think having a voice like that and having those ideas articulated is helpful. I don't know if you've noticed, but Jeb Bush, Rand Paul, Ted Cruz, and Marco Rubio have all talked about inequality of income in America being a major problem. Now, the thing that divides them is that Cruz, Paul, and Rubio all say the government should not do anything about it. And on Jeb Bush, we haven't heard the other shoe drop yet. And it's going to be very interesting if he gets into the general election to see whether or not he says there are things that should be done to raise the minimum wage, to do something about reviving manufacturing in this country, and so on and so forth. My hunch is, if he gets to the general election, he will do that. But we have to wait.
How do we bring manufacturing back to Ohio when investment firms are buying majority shares of companies and breaking them up? For example, the Timken Company and Timken Steel.
Well, I don't know enough about the Timken case to talk about it knowledgeably. I think one of the obligations we have as news people is to admit when we don't know that we don't know, and we got some homework to do. So I don't know about that case. But I do know that there are all kinds of companies, particularly startups. I don't know if you're aware of this. Americans talking about the economy talk about the importance of small business as the driving engine of growth. And the formation of new companies is one of the most critical things that happens in a successful economy. The rate of formation of small businesses in America has fallen by 50% over the last 30, 35 years under shareholder capitalism. Shareholder capitalism is actually strengthening the hands of big companies to do exactly what you said. They get more and more economic power concentrated, and they're buying smaller companies, and they're either absorbing them or breaking them up in the way you're talking. So that suggests that maybe there's some things we should do about regulating or taxing in one way or another either the buying of shares back by large companies when they go and buy their own shares back, or the stock options and the stock grants made to CEOs. You know, so much per share, and use that money to help finance the capital for small companies. Sometimes it's the smaller companies that are having trouble finding capital, and banks are reluctant to make the loans. Now, as the economy picks up speed, banks will become more willing. But over the last 5 or 6 years, the American banking system, listen to this, Bank of America, Citigroup, Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, right on down the line, they have been borrowing money from the Federal Reserve at between 0 and 1%. And they've been lending it out at 3.5%. That means we as taxpayers, through the Federal Reserve, are financing the profits of those companies. And as part of that deal, we should have been able to turn around and say to those companies, if you're going to make those profits, you must ease the terms by which you grant loans to small businesses so we can get more startups. But we haven't done that. And the reason we haven't done that is the bank lobbies in Washington are so powerful that it's impossible to pass legislation that would do that. And it's very difficult for the Obama administration, in the political environment it faces today, to be able to do that unilaterally. But I mean, one thing we can do is to begin to change the rules. Also, if you take a look at the funding, and I don't know the exact figures for this, but the funding for the Small Business Administration, which is in the business of helping the formation of small businesses, partly through loans, partly through other things they can do for small businesses. Funding for that has been cut steadily. This is all part of the business, and we got to cut the budget. We got to cut the deficit. So we've cut out apprenticeship training for young people. We've reduced the funding for small businesses. We've reduced the funding that is paid to businesses that have to shut factories down because of foreign competition and then need to go set up a plant somewhere else and retrain their workers. All those things are things that would help the American economy compete, both business and labor. And all of those have been cut steadily over the last 10 or 15 years. So one of the things we could do is just simply reverse those trends and say, hey, it makes sense to invest in our economy so we'll be more competitive. But that argument is rarely heard, number one, and number two, it gets drowned out by gotta cut taxes, gotta cut government, regardless of what the program is.
Do you consider union money dark money?
Certainly, union money is dark money too. Union money, there are 2, 3, 4 major channels of dark money. Politics. Now we'll have to get in a moment to what it means engage in politics. Then there are 501c6 organizations like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and they also have a tax, they have no tax exemption, but they have dark money. And then there are 501c5 organizations, which are union organizations. But the contributions of the union organizations have dropped dramatically. Number one, they don't have the money in the treasury, and number two, they've decided they want to use more open money. So the percentage of union dark money has declined dramatically because the percentage of the other dark money has grown. But yes, unions are involved in the dark money game too. Not a big surprise, but they're outgunned enormously. But yeah, they're in the game too. And in my opinion, it's all wrong. We're running out of tape, huh?
No.
That's right. You kind of touched on this, but let me tee it up for you. Most major countries faced a major collapse like Rome and Greece after 200 years. We are now over 200 years. Are we in line for a true major collapse? Is it thought to be in the next few years?
Well, I don't think the 200-year thing is what should interest us. In fact, the numbers differ. I think if you go to ancient Greece, it's more like 200 years. If you go to ancient Rome, it's more like 400. So, I mean, I don't think you're talking about a schedule here. The way the question's framed, it sounds as though there's something sort of automatic. There's a rhythm like pregnancy or life and death and that kind of stuff. I don't think so. Maybe I should end on this. Let me tell you a story. Is it going to come in the next few years? I virtually said to you that we're looking at a country that is in the process of writing its own obituary. And I believe that. I believe that my analysis as a reporter, I don't want to say that. I don't want to believe that. I'm not here today because I want that to happen. I'm here today for exactly the opposite reason. I'm here for the reason that lies behind the story I'm about to tell you. It's a story about Alfred Nobel. Nobel, was the guy for whom the Nobel Prizes are named, and he was a great munitions maker back in the 19th century, made his fortune selling arms, selling dynamite, and so forth. He had a brother who was in another field, a little bit younger than he was. I forget what field the brother was in, but the brother dies. They're both on up in their ages, they're both over 60, and the brother dies, and their obituary is done about the brother, and one is written in Francois, the Paris newspaper. And somebody sends it to a friend of Nobel's to share with Nobel. And the headline says in French, "Merchant of Death dies." And the guy hands it to Nobel. And Nobel looks at it, reads it, and he said, "Oh my God, they've written my obituary. This is my life. This is not my brother's life. It's the terriblest thing. This is the worst thing that's ever happened to me." And the friend says to him, "No, Mr. Nobel, it's not the worst thing that's happened to you. It may be the best thing that's happened to you. You can rewrite your own obituary." And that led to the foundation of the Nobel Prizes. So Nobel rewrote his own obituary. And I'm here to tell you, we can rewrite our own obituary, but we have to decide to do it. We cannot passively sit there and say somebody else can do it, must do it. Democracy is not a spectator sport. It is a participation sport. Everybody on the bench and on the team has to be involved, and not just for the elections. Yes, for the elections, vital, but not just for the elections, after the elections. And those of us in the media particularly, we have to be paying attention all the time to what's really going on. And then we have to have the nerve to deliver that news to people, and we have to have the resources to commit to telling that story. I think it's critically important, and I appreciate you giving me a chance to share these ideas with you today. Thank you.